Welcome back once again to Reignited. You saw the thumbnail, you know exactly what it is we're doing. We're replacing the water pump and the radiator in this Ram 2500 6.4 liter Hemi. Let's get into it, guys. All right, when I'm doing a job like this, I generally like to start from underneath first, because after you pull the radiator hoses off of there, all this stuff is going to be covered in coolant. So I like to do it when it's all dry. So this little plastic tray right here, you need to remove these little push pins, and this thing just kind of falls out of the way. And then the lower fan shroud assembly here, that just clips into place. It's not held on with any bolts. So go ahead and get that unclipped and pull that fan shroud assembly out of there. That is one giant dead bug. Gross. Pulling that lower fan shroud loose is an important step because it allows you to pull the upper fan shroud loose completely from the vehicle without actually having to remove the viscous cooling fan from the vehicle first. So pretty much no matter which way you try to spin it, this does end up being a very messy job. However, if you've watched my channel at all, you know that I hate making giant messes in my shop. So I try to minimize that as much as possible. Draining the coolant beforehand really helps with that. It's not going to alleviate it entirely. Of course, when you pull the water pump, you're still gonna make a little bit of a mess, but like I said, if I can try to minimize that as much as possible, I like to. So that is why we're going to drain the coolant now, try to get as much of that coolant out of the system as we can before we continue. Now for me, my process to drain the coolant on these trucks is I like to actually remove the fender well from the driver's side here, and that allows you terrific access to the drain plug on the radiator. This is not a necessary step. You don't have to go this far if you don't want to, but again, it can help minimize the mess. This is the radiator drain plug here. You can use a 16mm wrench on it to open it up. You don't need to keep spinning it out all the way because then it'll pop out and make a giant mess. All you need to do is open it until you feel it stop. As soon as you feel it stop, don't go any further, otherwise it'll come out completely. A couple of tips for you here. First of all, make sure you have your drain pan in the appropriate place so you can catch the coolant when it comes out. And more importantly, when you're draining the coolant system off of here, you want to make sure that either your radiator cap or your coolant reservoir bottle cap is off. That way there's not a vacuum on the system and it'll drain freely. Now you want to remove this closeout panel right here. It's just a little plastic panel held in place by several push pins. There we are. All right, I'm sure you can hear that our coolant is still draining on the vehicle. However, this upper radiator hose should be clear by now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to disconnect it from this side over here, and I'm going to pop the connection loose from the upper fan shroud. And I'm not going to remove it from the water pump just yet. I'm just going to lay the hose back out of the way. That way we can get the shroud out of here. And once we do that, then you can actually remove the hose itself. All right, now it's time to remove the upper fan shroud itself. Now it's held in place by a 13mm on this side and a 13mm on this side. The lower mounts are just slipped into place. There's no bolts holding it. So just remove those two 13mm bolts and the whole fan shroud should rise up out of here. Also make sure to disconnect your cooling fan plug here because there is an electric cooling fan inside there. So here's kind of the fun part. The electric cooling fan that is behind your primary shroud here, this is just held in place by these little tab guys here. So you'll need to remove the electric cooling fan assembly with the upper shroud assembly because it won't clear the cooling fan otherwise. So just push back on these tabs, pull it up just enough to get it out of the way. And then it's loose on both sides. And you can remove it. There we go. All right, now you can see with the fan shroud out of the way, we have plenty of room to get to our clamp for our upper radiator hose. Make sure of the alignment for your hose. The factory hose has a mark on it that actually lines up with this here, so you know like the orientation of the hose, how it's supposed to go on there. But we'll go ahead and remove the upper hose on there, and now we have plenty of access to remove our cooling fan. Now, as you guys can see, these cooling fans can be very, very difficult to remove from here. However, I'm going to show you a special tool that makes the job way easier. All right, I've shown this on my channel before, but the special tool I'm going to use is a fan clutch removal tool, and it requires that you have an air chisel, and it requires, of course, that you have shop air. Now, this tool is from a company called Lyle, and you have these components here. It comes with all different sizes for the different kind of fan clutches that you'll run into. You basically put that on there, and you attach this guy here, and you stick your air hammer on there, and blah, run it loose. Now you'll notice I am going this way with it. And why is that? It's because the threads on this fan clutch are left-hand threads. So I need to go clockwise with it to actually remove it. Look at that. A matter of seconds, breaks it free, you can spin it right off. Now, one key to this is that you have to keep the serpentine belt on to make that work, otherwise the pulley will just spin freely. So leave the serpentine belt on until you get it knocked loose, then you can just spin it right off. There we go. Now we have great access to all the serpentine belt components. We can get our serpentine belt off, we can take our tensioner off on there, we can take this idler pulley off here, and we can take off any of the other components that are going to be in the way for getting the water pump out of here. Always a good idea before you remove a serpentine belt to take note of the orientation of it, where everything goes. Easy to look it up online these days, but still it might save you a step if you just remember what the belt routing is. Okay, so one of the things that makes this job a pain on the 6.4 liter trucks is that you can no longer just remove the water pump assembly from the vehicle with the intake on. There's this coolant tube here that runs underneath the intake manifold that has a clamp on it. So it forces you to remove the intake manifold if you are going to actually do a water pump. So that's what we're gonna work on next. These little tab guys here, that push pin on the top, you just push that down, lock pin, and it'll actually disconnect off of there. There's a lot of electrical connectors that are involved with the intake manifold assembly. You have the injectors, you have the purge solenoid deal here, you have the short runner valve connection here, you have the throttle body and some EGR components. So just make sure you're getting all of those components actually disconnected before you try to remove this. And another thing you'll have to do is you'll probably have to remove the alternator assembly as well to give yourself enough room to actually get the intake manifold out of there. So bit of a pain. We got some disassembly involved here, but we'll get to it. It's a good idea anytime you're undoing your power feed from your alternator to make sure you disconnect your battery, isolate it with a rag or something like that, because if this thing grounds anywhere, it's going to spark and it could potentially blow a primary fuse going to the fuse box. There we go. Okay, so we've got our alternator out of there, so now we have the room to actually position the intake manifold up enough to actually get it up out of there. Now, one thing we need to do here next is we need to go ahead and disconnect the EGR crossover tube here. That'll allow this intake manifold to come free. Now the big one, we're gonna go through and disconnect all of our injectors on both sides, and then towards the back of the intake manifold, the wire harness is actually mounted to the intake manifold. There's a 10 mil nut on this side and a 10 mil nut on this side. Once you remove those nuts, you have to slide the wiring harness up and off of those studs. That way the intake manifold will come free. These fuel injector clips all do have these red locking safety tabs that need to be pulled up before you can remove these. I like to use a hook tool like this and just get behind it, give it a little bit of force. It's gonna fight me. All right, got that lock clip free. These things will fight you, and if they break off in there, it's a huge pain, so really try your best not to break them off. Now, with the lock pin out of there, you can depress the pin and disconnect the line. There you go. All right, so you can see back here at the back of the manifold, that is one of the 10 mil nuts I was speaking about for the wire harness that runs around the back of the intake manifold. Also, don't forget to unplug your map sensor there. So there's one on this side here, then there's one on this side here. And then like I mentioned, you wanna go ahead and after you get those nuts off there, go ahead and slide that harness up and off of those studs to get the intake manifold out. Okay, bit of a struggle there. Sometimes those 8 mil bolts can be really stuck in there, and keep in mind that they're very long and skinny bolts, so just Go slow with them because it's very easy to snap one if you exert too much force on one. So if they're fighting you, just go real slow and you should be able to get them all out eventually. Okay, we got all those 8mm bolts out of there. I went ahead and got the wire harness off of the studs at the back of the manifold there. I think we're ready to start lifting the manifold up out of the way. Another point I forgot to mention is that the EGR tube itself that's bolted to the intake manifold, it does have to come out altogether because again, it sticks into the intake manifold quite a ways. So gotta take this tube off completely. There we go. Okay, our intake manifold's out of the way. Now, while that's out of there, one thing that I like to do is I like to clean up all the intake ports, maybe vacuum out some of these areas so that I don't have to worry about that dirt falling into those holes there. And now we can actually access our coolant tube here and loosen our clamps so that we can actually get our water pump off of the engine. So here's our coolant tube here that comes up from our water pump. There's a clamp here that we need to loosen this so we can get this hose off of here. Also, there's a 10mm bolt right here that holds it in place. You'll notice that the ears of this clamp were pointing down when it was installed, and that's because it needs to be able to clear the intake manifold. If you install it with the ears pointing upwards, I'm suspecting that it will probably contact the intake manifold. So when I reinstall this, I'll probably put it in sideways and then spin it to where the ears are back down at the bottom again. All right, so now we're free, and when we remove the water pump, this should come right with it. There's a little connector here on the thermostat housing. Make sure to actually disconnect that. All right, so around the perimeter of the water pump, it is a series of 13mm bolts that hold it in place. I think behind this bracket here, you're looking at a 15mm, but pretty much all the other ones are a 13mm. Now, when you're taking these apart, you'll realize that some of these bolts are longer, some of them are shorter, so try to keep track of exactly where they go. Okay, once you've got all the 13mm bolts removed from here, go ahead and take a little plastic mallet and go ahead and tap it off. You can try to pry it a little bit, but if it's resisting you a lot, then you're just plain missing a bolt. Stop cranking away on it. That's a good idea while you have the water pump off to go ahead and clean up this mating surface a little bit. Sometimes over the course of years, you can see some of the buildup of grime and stuff that ends up in there. So go ahead and just take a little short razor blade or whatever and just scrape it up a little bit. Don't need to go crazy with it. Just try to clean it up so that the new seal has something really good to seat to. Okay, so we've got the new water pump assembly in there, and a couple of things I want to point out here. One is I would go ahead and hand start all of the bolts first, just to make sure that your alignment stays good, because there is a little bit of play in this thing, and if you go tightening down one bolt and then another bolt, by the time you get to the last bolt, it might not actually thread in smoothly. So go ahead and hand thread them all in first, and then you're good to go. The water pump assembly does not come with a thermostat housing, so if you need a new thermostat, this would be a great time to do it. I'm not going to do it on this truck because the thermostat that was on there was literally just replaced days ago, so I'm just gonna swap it over from the old water pump to the new water pump. So the coolant tube we talked about that goes up over the top of the water pump and goes into the intake valley there, this actually swaps over from the old water pump to the new water pump assembly. It actually just slips out through the top here. That's just an O-ring here that holds it in place, so go ahead and pop this tube out of here, but before you reinstall it to the new water pump, go ahead and put some lubrication on that O-ring. You don't want to have a chance of this O-ring pinching or being cut in any way, because then you'd have to take the intake manifold back off again. So make sure you lubricate that O-ring, slip it back into the new water pump, you're good to go. So that's it for the water pump. At this point, it's just a matter of reassembly. I'm going to go ahead and reinstall most all the components, get the intake manifold back on there, and get the accessory drive back on. But before I go ahead and put the cooling viscous fan back on, I'm going to go ahead and replace the radiator, and I'll show you a few tricks that go along with that as well. There we go. Again, with all these intake manifold bolts, you want to go ahead and start them first. and make sure that they're all at least a little bit in, because again, these bolts are so small, it's very easy to cross thread them in there. So go ahead and start all of them first, and then once you know they're all started, then tighten them down. So we are fully back together now, got all the accessory drive back on there. I went ahead and put on a brand new serpentine belt as well. So we're in good shape there. Now it's time to focus on the radiator. First thing we're going to do, there are two 13mm bolts there and there on the back side. We want to go ahead and remove those two 13mm bolts to allow the radiator to fold backward just a little bit. That'll give us better access to unbolting the condenser and the trans cooler from the front of the radiator assembly. All right, now there's so many components that are bolted to the radiator assembly itself. This is where we got to take our time and be careful not to actually bend or pinch any of these lines. However, if we're able to kind of fold the radiator back just a little bit, kind of push it back, we can access a lot of those bolts that hold the other coolers and condenser to the radiator assembly. That way we can just lift the whole thing out of here without having to discharge our AC or lose any of our other fluids. All right, so you're able to see there, I was able to kind of push it backward even just, you know, a couple inches, but that affords me plenty of room to get down here and get to these various 12mm and 10mm bolts that hold all the other coolers in place. If you look here for the trans cooler, you have a 12mm here and another 12mm right down here. And then on this side, there's no bolts, it actually just slips into here. So once you unbolt it from this side, you can kind of tilt it this way and slide it out. So, and then the condenser itself, you've got various 12mm focus. So the condenser itself, you have various 12mm bolts that hold that in place. Same thing, it just slides out on the other end. Now, there's also a bolt down in here that actually holds this whole assembly to the side of the radiator. So you'll need to find that bolt and remove it. Okay, I've unbolted all of the coolers from the radiator. There are two 10mm bolts that actually hold both the AC lines and the trans cooler lines to the side of the radiator. You'll need to remove both of those. Both of the coolers just slide straight out of the radiator assembly. So now our radiator is clear. We should be free to pull this thing out of here. Let's give it a try. Success! It's a good idea when you pull your new radiator out of your box to really just do a quick check and make sure all of the ports, all of the connections are all in the correct spot. And also make sure that all of your fasteners are already hooked in there, all your bushings, everything like that. This is a factory unit, so it's just a complete drop-in unit. There we go, new radiator is in. Really not that difficult of a job, far simpler than the water pump itself was. Again, you don't need to actually discharge the AC system or anything like that. You can get enough room to take all those things off. So at this point, now it's just a matter of reassembly. We're gonna put the viscous cooling fan back on. We're gonna put the electric fan with the fan shroud back in, raise the thing up, bolt everything up from the bottom, and then we're gonna fill it with coolant and call this job done. So the last thing we need to do on this vehicle is go ahead and fill up the cooling system. Now, if you've done this sort of work before, you know what a pain it is to try to get it to bleed out properly, not have any air in the system, run through a heat cycle, sucks in more coolant, you add more, do that 3 or 4 times, and finally it's bled. Well, you could bypass all that ridiculously annoying frustration by picking up one of these vacuum coolant bleed systems. Now, there's a million of them out there. There's a ton of different brands out there. There's super, super cheap ones, which I don't really like because they don't work that well. And then there's kind of mid-grade ones, which work just fine. I don't have a problem with those. You don't have to go to the really big name ones. I'll put a link down in the description below for the Amazon link to one that's very similar to this. And man, I'm telling you, if you work on this sort of stuff, you've got to pick one up because it changes everything. And what's really nice about them is that because it's a vacuum bleed system, you can let it sit with vacuum on it for a period of minutes and find out if you have any leaks in your system before you add any coolant. That way you're not wasting materials if you end up having a leak somewhere. Like if I turn this valve and this thing ends up bleeding off almost immediately, I know I've got a leak somewhere. I got to track that down before I put any coolant in there. So an extra bonus there. All right, let's get some coolant in this thing. So like I said, I'm going to go ahead and let that sit for a couple of minutes. We can watch that gauge and see if it drops at all. If it does, we know there's a leak somewhere in the system. If it holds pretty much right where it's at, we're golden to actually start adding coolant. All right, right, let that sit for about 5 minutes. I'm seeing no discernible change in the vacuum value that's read there. So we're gonna start adding some coolant. Once it's drawn all the way down and it's no longer vacuuming any coolant up in there, you can go ahead and shut these valves on here and top off the reservoir if needed. But the great thing is, that's pretty much it. You can double check it when you're done, but most of the time it's going to be spot on with no air pockets in the system. Love it. So there it is, another job done. Water pump and radiator installed on a 6.4 liter Hemi Ram truck. Now, the last thing we have to do here is we have to fire the truck up, make sure it comes up to temperature properly, make sure the thermostat's working, the coolant cycling. Once we do all that, it's time to get this thing back to the customer. All right, you guys, thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for supporting as always. If you want to follow me on Instagram, it's at reignited.tx. And we'll see you next time on Reignited. Just like that, I went too far.